We're continuing to look at the Apostles' Creed, which is the ancient document that summarizes Christians' beliefs pretty briefly. And today we're going to be talking about Jesus' ascension, when Jesus went from earth to heaven. So I'd like to begin by reading part of the Apostles' Creed, and then we'll dive into it. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. He was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead. On the third day, he rose again. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. This Thursday, May 13th, is the Feast of the Ascension in the historical church calendar. On this day, the church celebrates and remembers the ascension of Jesus into heaven, which we read about in the book of Acts, in chapter 1. Acts begins like this: In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. After his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. So Jesus died, he suffered, and then he proved to his disciples that he was resurrected. He was bodily raised. He wasn't a ghost or a spirit or a presence. He was there in person, in the body, raised again. And he came to his disciples many times and he taught them. And he did so for 40 days, it says in this passage. So Jesus' ascension takes place 40 days after Easter Sunday, which is why we celebrate it on a Thursday, 40 days after Easter Sunday. This year, that falls on May 13th. When we think about Jesus' story and where he is now, a lot of us skip over that 40-day period. You may know the story that Jesus was raised in the flesh and then he ascended to heaven, but because of how we think, we often act as if that weren't true. We subconsciously may think that Jesus went straight from the grave to sitting with God. Like we gloss over that 40-day period. We may think that Jesus died and then after his death, he was raised to heavenly spiritual existence with God. And even if we know the story in more detail, we often act as if that were the case because our Western thinking about the afterlife has been shaped by the philosophy of Plato. Plato thought about there being a lower physical realm and a higher spiritual realm, and we were meant to discover the higher spiritual realm to escape from the lower physical realm. Platonic philosophy is that we ought to escape this physical realm for the thing that is better, the spiritual realm. And so many of us think about going to heaven after we die as being what we are promised. We get to escape this terrible world of suffering and go to the perfect world where things are spiritual and beautiful. We think of it as better than earthly physical existence, and we also may think of it as somehow less real than this existence. In this world, we have bodies that we can feel. In the next world, we just have spiritual wispiness. We're ghosts or spirits that don't have bodies. So when we think about Jesus' ascension, we can imagine it as Jesus getting to escape from this terrible physical existence and leaving it behind for a non-tangible spiritual existence that is less real, but better. And maybe we get to do that someday too. But that's not what the story of Jesus' ascension is about at all. So the first challenge we have to deal with when we read this passage is to strip back the layers of Platonic thinking, to get back to a Jewish way of thinking about the difference between heaven and earth. The second challenge we face when we read about the ascension has to do with our modern understanding of science versus how we tend to read the biblical ideas. When we hear about Jesus ascending or going up into heaven, we can think that the description that we read about in the book of Acts is incompatible with our modern understanding of science, of meteorology with the clouds, and of how the Earth is positioned in the solar system and in the galaxy and in the universe. So maybe we need to consider what the book of Acts is trying to tell us about Jesus, heaven, earth, and ourselves. So let's read the rest of these verses about Jesus' ascension, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we need to think through. Let's pick it up in Acts 1, verse 4. On one occasion, while he was eating with them, he gave them this command: "Do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father has promised, which you have heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit." Then they gathered around him and asked him, "Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" He said to them, "It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." After he had said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven." We could spend a lot of time talking about Jesus' conversation with his disciples, and very important information about the kingdom of God and who he is, who they are. But today we're going to focus on the verses about Jesus' actual ascension, verses 9 through 11. In verse 9, it says Jesus was taken up before their very eyes. The word in Greek that's used there, that's translated as taken up, can also be translated as he was lifted, raised, or exalted. And some other meanings are possible for this Greek word, like to swell up. This word can also mean to swell up, or for a person to lift up their leg. So this word is actually pretty similar to how we use the word to go up or to elevate someone in English. In English, you can raise someone up and elevate them by putting them on a rocket and sending them from the earth to the sky, from the earth into space. We could think of a rocket moving someone from the realm of the earth to the realm of the sky. We could also think of an elevator as moving someone up to another floor. It's the same word. When we think of moving someone from one floor of a building to another, that might remind you of someone who works in an office building getting a promotion, where they're moving up in how much they're getting paid. They're moving up in their responsibility. They're moving up in their authority in the company. We can also move someone up by causing them to graduate from school, from high school or college, or moving up from first grade to second grade. You can be moved up to another phase in life, or a deeper understanding of something. So the idea of being moved up doesn't just refer to moving up from something that is physically lower to something that is physically higher. When you are promoted from one job to another, or one grade in school to another, you may not actually go up in the building. You may go to another room, or you may go down a floor, depending on how your school or job is laid out. The main idea here is that Jesus is being moved up from earthly physical existence to heavenly existence. This sentence often leads us to think that our ultimate destiny is heavenly existence and not earthly. But we'll see later on that this is a misunderstanding. So the main idea here is that Jesus is moving from earthly existence in his body and on the earth physically to heavenly existence, which we'll see later is still in his body, but it's in a different place. But what's going on with the clouds? It does say something about the clouds. So when we read clouds and going up, we think, oh, he must be going up into the sky. When we read the description of what takes place, it seems incompatible of what we know about the earth and about galaxies. We read this passage as if we're reading about Jesus launching off like Superman into the sky. But the meaning of this passage isn't really about that. In the book of Daniel, there is this strange vision of the Son of Man, and we've talked about this before. We talked about it a few weeks ago, about Jesus' identity as Son of Man. And in this vision that the prophet Daniel has, he's talking about a human being, a Son of Man, who follows God's will and is separate from God, and he's crushed by the empires, the human power structures, but ultimately is vindicated as being the example of what a human being ought to look like. And in Daniel's vision, in chapter 7, verse 13, he writes, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man." He was a human being, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. So in this dream that Daniel has, this true human being comes up from the earth to heaven, to the throne room of God, and he arrives to the throne room accompanied by the clouds. and he ends up being seated next to God to be worshipped. Daniel ends up being very troubled by this. How could a human being be worshipped as God? And so in Jewish thinking, there was this idea that there would come a human being who was separate from God. He was really a human, but also was God because he is worshipped as God. And so the clouds are the image of the elevation of this perfect person who is distinct from God, but is God, to be seated with God as King of heaven and earth and to be worshipped as God. So Luke, who is the author of the book of Acts, is not including the clouds in Acts 1:9 to give us a description of the weather conditions on the day of Jesus' ascension. Instead, Luke is drawing our attention to Jesus' moving on up as a way of fulfilling the prophecy of Daniel 7. So Jesus is not just going from existence in a geographic location on earth to a geographic location of heaven. Instead, Jesus is also taking the throne. He is being revealed to be God, and he is being revealed to be the true human being who defines what humanity is meant to look like. So when we imagine this, a lot of times we imagine the Superman idea or Neo from the Matrix. He's getting taken off from the ground up into the sky. But there's another way that I think might be a little bit closer to what's taking place and at least helps us who live in this age of modern science to make sense of this. A lot of science fiction stories involve multiple dimensions based on what theoretical physicists and mathematicians have discovered and proposed over the last 100 years or so. We can't say exactly what took place with Jesus' ascension, but one way of thinking about Jesus' ascension that fits with how we think about the way the world works today looks like Jesus moving from one dimension or plane of existence to another dimension or plane of existence. So if you've seen a sci-fi show or movie or read a book where there are portals between worlds or doorways between worlds, that could be a way to help you imagine this. So when I read this story now, two images come to my mind. One is the older idea of Jesus physically being lifted up into the sky, but I also have this second idea of a gateway or a doorway between the earthly realm and the heavenly realm that Jesus is stepping through. I'm sure neither of these images is exactly what happened, but the author of the book of Acts, Luke, is describing it as best as he can based on his own understanding of earthly existence. The point of this account is to tell us that Jesus has transcended earthly existence and is now located in the heavenly realm. And this elevation of Jesus is not only an ascension, moving on up, but it's also an accession. He is taking the throne. It's his enthronement. Luke's inclusion of the cloud image is meant to show us that Jesus is enthroned as the true human. He shows us what humans are meant to be. And he's enthroned as God, who is worshipped. He is both God and he's distinct from God. And this is the beginning of our understanding of the Trinity. Luke offers us a ground level view. What did the disciples see when they saw Jesus move on up into the heavenly realm? What did it look like from the earth's perspective? But there's another passage in the New Testament that tells us what Jesus' ascension looked like from heaven's perspective, the view from above. The book of Revelation spends a lot of its time expounding the vision of Daniel 7 in a very beautiful and artful way, with descriptions of Jesus' enthronement. And in Revelation 5:5-6, we read, "Then one of the elders said to me, 'Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals.' Then I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, encircled by 4 living creatures and the elders. The lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth." So there's this very symbolic description of the heavenly throne room, where God is seated on the throne, and John hears about a lion, this conqueror who is the king of Israel, who has come and is worthy to be God's right-hand man. And when John turns, he sees a lamb that looks as if it has been slain. So he hears about this conquering lion, and he turns and sees a slaughtered lamb. And this lamb ends up sitting with God on the throne and being worshipped as God. John, who writes Revelation, is showing how Jesus fulfills the promise of Daniel 7. So from the earthly perspective, we see Luke's report in the book of Acts of Jesus being the Son of Man coming on the clouds and being seated on the throne. And from the heavenly perspective, we see John's report in the book of Revelation of the Son of Man coming on the clouds and being seated with God on the throne and being worshiped. And in Revelation 5, Jesus is worshiped specifically because of his sacrificial death. He is enthroned as king alongside the Father. So when we say that Jesus ascended into heaven, it must lead directly into, and he is seated at the right hand of the Father. And that's why these two lines are next to each other in the Apostles' Creed. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. When we talk about Jesus, we're not just saying that he died and then went on to spiritual existence with God and gets to rest. Instead, all of this language is about his enthronement as King of heaven and earth over both the realm of God and the realm of humanity, where he is the rightful king because of his sacrificial death. So we've seen the view from the earth and the view from above. Let's return to the view from the earth, back to the book of Acts in Acts 1:9. Again, it says, "After he said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight." Jesus leaves the earth and enters heaven. And when we hear this, when we come to it through the lens of Western thinking, we are so influenced by Plato's philosophy. In Plato's philosophy, as we mentioned earlier, there is an idea of the spiritual plane and the earthly plane, the material plane. We're meant to escape this bad material existence for the better spiritual existence. But a Jewish idea of heaven and earth is a little different from that. In the Jewish idea of heaven and earth, God made both heaven and earth. In Genesis 1:1, the very first sentence of the Bible says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." They were meant to go together. The story of the fall of humanity is the story of the separation of heaven and earth. And the Jewish idea is that they still have influence on each other. They are still meant to connect, and there continue to be places of overlap. The temple is a place of overlap. Instead of thinking them as different kinds of existence, we ought to think of them as different realms of existence. The heavenly realm is the place for God and the spiritual beings, and they also thought of the sky and the stars as belonging to that. And then the earth is the realm for humans and animals and plants. We are meant to care for this place, and the spiritual beings, the angels, are meant to care for the heavenly realm, and we're all meant to do this in a way that brings them into harmony, into shalom, with each other and within, under God's rule. But they aren't in harmony. We have discord and chaos in our world. And so God promises that he will renew these things and draw them back together. That's the Jewish way of thinking about it, which is quite different from the Greek way, that we're meant to escape this bad physical existence for a higher spiritual existence. So when we read this story, we need to do our best to stop thinking in this Greek way and start thinking in the Jewish way. We are meant to understand that God wants to bring heaven and earth back together. So Jesus is moving on up from the earth to the heavens, but that's not that to say that God is abandoning the earth, or that is Jesus' ultimate destiny, to just be in heaven. This makes sense because Jesus taught us to pray that God's kingdom would come and his will would be done on earth as in heaven. This is not a story of Jesus getting to escape this terrible physical existence, and that would show that we will one day also get to escape from this terrible place. There's a really important detail to think about. Jesus' body is not left behind. A lot of people think that Jesus isn't physical anymore, that he left behind physical existence. He did not leave behind physical existence. If he had, his body would have been left on the ground when he ascended into heaven. Jesus' body goes with him into heaven. It's not that he leaves behind physical existence. Rather, this very same body that was conceived on the earth in Mary's uterus, that very same body that ate and drank, that ate the Passover meal, that very same body that was beaten and flogged and spit on and crucified and killed, that very same body that was resurrected, that body is now seated at the right hand of the Father. Jesus' earthly, bodily, human existence is incorporated into the identity of God. I even think about the word incorporated involves the body. Jesus's corporeal nature, his bodily nature, is incorporated into the identity of God and is worshipped on the heavenly throne. This is not the story of escaping lesser physical existence for a higher spiritual existence. Instead, this is the story of the redemption of the physical and its translation into the spiritual. This is the story of the union of heaven and earth, the marriage of heaven and earth. The passage continues with the arrival of the angels. Just as Jesus goes up from the earth into heaven, the angels step down from heaven into earth. And again, we're not necessarily talking about going up and down in terms of three-dimensional space. We don't know for sure. It says in verse 10, they were looking intently up into the sky as he was going. And I want to pause and address this. When we read about the disciples looking up intently into the sky, we can also read that as the disciples gazing into the doorway of heaven. They are looking upwards. They are seeing where Jesus has just gone in his elevation into the heavens, into the sky. So they may be physically looking up into the sky. They may be gazing through a door. It's not exactly one or the other. They were looking intently up into the sky as Jesus was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. Men of Galilee, they said, why do you stand here looking into the sky, into the heavens? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. Jesus has left, but is coming again. This shows us that earthly existence is not something to be escaped. If it were, there's no way Jesus would be coming back. Jesus is going to the capital to go be crowned and to sit on the throne, but that doesn't mean that he's abandoning the part of the country that he rules here. He is going to come back. God is not abandoning the earth, but will ultimately complete the union of heaven and earth. And the Apostles' Creed continues. It says, he ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. When we hear about Jesus being the judge, we often think about his judgment of sending people to heaven and hell. We think in very moralistic terms of you are good, you're bad, you're saved, you get to be part of God's eternity, or you don't get to be a part of it. We're not going to talk today about the nature of hell, but I do want to spend some time thinking about what it means for Jesus to be a judge. A few weeks ago, when we were talking about Jesus's identity as Son of Man, we looked at Matthew 25, where Jesus describes himself to be the eternal judge. In the Jewish ideas of the Son of Man, they weren't expecting the Son of Man to be the eternal judge. They thought only God would do that. So when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man and reveals himself as judge, they interpret this as blasphemy. He says in that passage, he will send the righteous to eternal life and the unrighteous to eternal punishment. Jesus says he is God because only God is judge. And he tied his role as judge to his identity as the Son of Man. So when the book of Acts in this passage and the book of Revelation in Revelation 5 use these images of the Son of Man, these images of the clouds, when they use these images of the Son of Man to describe Jesus' ascension, it shows that he is not only God, that he's not only the ideal human being, that he's not only king, but what he said about himself being judge is proven to be true. Jesus in Matthew 25 called himself judge and Son of Man. So when his identity as Son of Man is proven to be right through his going up into heaven with the clouds, it proves that he is the judge. Lately, I've been thinking about how Jesus' judgment is much more complicated than simply being the judge in a court of law who issues a guilty or innocent verdict and sentences people. If we limit Jesus' judgment to our cultural ideas about the criminal justice system, then we are limiting Jesus based on our own experience. Now, we also think about judgment in a lot of other ways. We think about being a judge in a lot of other ways. There are a lot of other things that judges do besides criminal court. They do family court, they do civil court, they do all kinds of things. But there are also other kinds of judges besides in a legal setting. If there's a cooking contest or a talent show, we might have judges who decide which contestant has done their best to bring beauty into the world. A building inspector can judge whether a building has been built to code. Or a contractor might inspect the building that needs some repairs and then offer their judgment about what needs to be fixed. We normally would call that giving an estimate or an evaluation, but we can also think of it as this contractor offering their judgment. The building may be judged as condemned, it needs to be torn down entirely, or maybe it's judged fine as is, or most likely it's judged as it needs some work. At the end of the work, there might be the final judgment by that building inspector. So when we think of Jesus as judge, we ought to include all of these broader ways of thinking. Jesus will come to offer final judgment as he said he would in Matthew 25. But he also is already the judge right now. His life, death, resurrection, and ascension are our standard. We judge ourselves according to his story and his identity, and he judges us according to his story and his identity. Not only in moralistic terms. It's not only are you as good as Jesus or are you bad compared to Jesus. We often limit it to that and we get caught in this cycle of guilt and shame. But also, Jesus is our standard of beauty. Like a judge in court, we can ask if our lives look right compared to Jesus. Are we morally as good as Jesus? But like a judge of art, we can also ask if our lives look as beautiful as Jesus. Do our lives look as beautiful and good and true as the Jesus who gave his life and was raised again? Now, the scripture tells us that Jesus is coming back to this world. God is not abandoning it. He is not going to give the world the death penalty. He's going to renew it. Or he's not going to be like a building inspector who completely condemns the building and destroys it. Instead, he is going to restore it and renew it. Jesus' crucified and resurrected body that came from this world is going to be his crucified and resurrected body forever. He shows that he wants to incorporate our broken physical existence into his eternal spiritual existence. He will come again to renew this world. So that tells us of God's love for our physical embodied existence. He wants to heal us. He wants to restore us and renew us. And that can motivate us to be people who bring wholeness, shalom, harmony to the people around us and to the creation itself. When we say that I believe in God the Father and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, he ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father, and he will come again to judge the living and the dead. It's great to believe that in our minds. And we also can live it out by being those who take it to heart and who offer our love to the physical needs around us because Jesus' bodily existence has been wrapped up in his identity as God. Next week, we're going to look at Pentecost, the coming of the Holy Spirit and the birth of the church. Just 10 days after Jesus goes up, the Holy Spirit comes down, so that we can become those who are the overlap between heaven and earth, who live in this way of unifying all things under Jesus' rule as the one who is seated at the right hand of the Father. We do that knowing that Jesus is ultimately the one who will judge everything and who will make it all right.